There is one root that flavored America for 100 years, and then in 1960 the government pulled it clean off every shelf in the country. And here is the thing I want you to hear right at the start. The very taste that made this root beloved, the thing that put it in your root beer and your candy and your grandmother's spring tonic, is the exact same thing that got it thrown out. Stay with me, because before we are done I am going to show you the strangest part of this whole story. The twist that still doesn't sit right with an old man like me, and it is sitting in your kitchen spice rack right now. My name is Amos, and for 60 years I have dug roots and gathered wild plants in these Appalachian mountains the same ways my grandmother taught me before I could read. I am not a doctor, so nothing I tell you today is medical advice, just an old root man telling you what he knows. Now, before we go any further, I have to be honest with you. Only a very small percentage of the people who watch this channel are actually subscribed. If you love the old plants and the forgotten history behind the things we eat and drink, even half as much as I do, then do consider subscribing. It is completely free, and you can always change your mind later. It genuinely helps an old man keep making these. Right? Then let us get into it. Let me be honest with you before I go one step further. I am not here to sell you a tea, or a tincture, or a bag of dried bark out of the back of a truck. I have got nothing to move and nothing to push. I am just an old man who has walked these hills long enough to watch a plant go from being in near about every American home to being a thing folks are half afraid to say out loud, and I think when you hear the whole story you will feel the same quiet puzzlement I do. That is all. No agenda. Just the truth as I have come to know it. So let me start with the tree itself, because you have walked past it 100 times and never known it. Sassafras is one of the easiest trees in the whole eastern woods to know, once somebody shows you the trick. Look at the leaves. On one single tree, on one single branch, you will find 3 different shapes growing side by side. One is a plain oval, smooth as a spoon. One looks like a mitten, with a little thumb poking out to the side. And one has 3 fingers, like a hand held up. 3 shapes, 1 tree. There is not another common tree in these mountains that does that. And if you are still not sure, you kneel down, you dig a little side root, and you scrape it with your thumbnail, and you smell it, and there it is, sweet and sharp and warm all at once. It smells exactly like old-fashioned root beer, because as you are about to learn, it is old-fashioned root beer. That smell comes from an oil that lives in the root and the bark. About 80% of that oil is one single flavoring thing, and it carries a warmth that folks have tried to describe for centuries. A little like licorice, a little like cinnamon, a touch of citrus, a whisper of vanilla underneath. You put all of that in one root growing wild by the fence line, and you can start to see why people lost their heads over it. Now, the first people to know this root well were the native peoples of eastern North America, and they knew it long before any ship ever crossed the water. They used the root bark brewed into teas for fevers and for upset stomachs, and they used it to clean out wounds. They mashed it into poultices to lay on the skin. They chewed the young twigs soft and used them as a kind of toothbrush, and I will tell you, that is not a bad idea at all. But the finest thing they made from this tree did not come from the root, it came from the leaves. The Choctaw people down along the Gulf Coast made something they knew how to make just right. In the fall, after the first cool snap, when the young leaves had turned red along about the middle of October, they would gather those leaves. They dried them slow in the shade, never in the hot sun, because the sun steals the color and the strength. Then they pounded those dried leaves into a fine green powder, and they sifted it soft. That powder thickens a soup and flavors it at the same time, and it is a beautiful thing. The French who came to Louisiana called it filé, which just means thread, because of the way it pulls in the pot, and that green powder became the backbone of Louisiana gumbo. By the early 1700s, it was folded right into Creole and Cajun cooking, and it never left. A French naturalist even drew the tree in his big history of Louisiana in 1758. And here is a thing I love. By the early 1900s, Choctaw women were still carrying their sassafras leaves and their filé powder to the French market in New Orleans, setting up twice a week, selling the same thing their grandmothers made. 300 years, and the thread never broke. But the Europeans, when they got hold of this root, they did not see a soup thickener. They thought they had found a miracle. There was a Spanish writer named Nicolas Monardes, and his book came out in English in 1577 under a title that just about says it all, Joyful News Out of the Newfound World. And he claimed this root could treat gout and swelling and headaches, and colds, and toothaches, and stomach aches, and stones in the kidney, and a whole long list besides. Now whatever you do, don't believe a man who tells you one root cures everything. But folks believed it then, and I will tell you the real reason why. There was a terrible sickness moving through Europe in those years, a shameful one that ate people up slow, and the only treatment they had was mercury, which is a poison, and the cure was near as bad as the disease. And people got it in their heads that this new sickness had come from the New World, so surely the New World must hold the cure, and they decided that cure was sassafras. So ships crossed the whole Atlantic Ocean, all that dangerous water, just to fill their holds with the root of a tree. Some of the colony charters actually set quotas, telling the settlers how much sassafras they had to send back. Even John Smith up at Jamestown wrote about gathering it. And here's the part that stops people cold. For a short stretch in the early 1600s, sassafras was the second most valuable thing shipped out of the American colonies. Not second among the plants, second among everything. The only thing worth more coming out of this whole new land was tobacco. A wild root dug out of the dirt with a stick, standing second only to tobacco. That is how badly they wanted it. Think about that for a moment. Men crossed an ocean they were half afraid of, in little wooden ships, and the treasure they carried home in the belly of the boat was not gold and it was not silver. It was the root of a scrubby tree that grows like a weed along every fence row in this country. And I have to smile at it because if you went out today and told your neighbor you had found a fortune growing wild at the edge of his hayfield, he would look at you like you had lost your mind. Now that craze cooled off the way crazes do because the root never did cure that sickness. It could not, and once the fashionable folks in England figured that out, they dropped the tea and moved on. But here's the thing, the tree was just too useful to fade away. And it grew wild absolutely everywhere, from Maine down to Florida and clear over into Texas. It loved the edges of cleared farmland, and it spread underground by root suckers, throwing up new shoots, so you could never really get rid of it. The supply became endless. And when a thing is endless, the price drops, and when the price drops, everybody can have it. So sassafras quietly became one of the most ordinary ingredients in American life. It went into candy, it went into patent medicines by the wagon load, it went into toothpaste, and I mean the big sellers like Pepsodent, which was one of the best-selling toothpastes in the whole country in the 1930s and 1940s. It went into soaps and perfumes to make them smell sweet. A fellow named Thomas Adams flavored some of the very first American chewing gum with sassafras and licorice back in the 1870s, and chiclets followed along in 1900. And all through Appalachia and the rural South, folks drank sassafras tea every spring, a cup of it to, as they said, clean the blood after a long winter. Even the soldiers in the Civil War brewed it in their camps. This was not some rare thing, this was in the cupboard, right next to the flour. But you want to know what truly made it a national treasure? Root beer. There was a pharmacist up in Philadelphia named Charles Elmer Hyers, and in 1876 he brought his root beer to the Great Centennial Exhibition, the big fair celebrating 100 years of the country. That same fair is where folks first saw the telephone, and the typewriter, and even ketchup. And right there among all those wonders was Hyers and his root beer, and the anchor of the whole flavor, the thing that made it taste like it tasted, was sassafras root. Now Hyers was a clever man. He first wanted to call it root tea, but he figured working men would not line up for tea, so he called it root beer instead, and that made all the difference. He sold little packets of powder for 25 cents, and each packet made about a gallon at home. Then he made a syrup for the soda fountains in 1884, and by 1893 he was selling it in bottles. And he sold it as a healthy thing, a wholesome blend of 16 wild roots and berries. It came out a good 10 years before Coca-Cola ever did. And the others followed, Barks and IBC and A and W and Dad's, and every last one of them built that flavor on the same root. And then something funny helped it along. In 1920, the country banned liquor. That was Prohibition. Well, root beer had the word beer sitting right there in its name, but there was not a drop of liquor in it, so it was perfectly legal. A man could walk into a place and order a root beer and feel like he was getting away with something, and it was allowed. Sales just took off. And by the time Prohibition ended in 1933, root beer had grown into its own beloved thing, standing on its own 2 feet. By the middle of the century, sassafras was woven straight through everyday American life, from the bathroom sink to the soda fountain to the gumbo pot. Now here is where I have to tell you about the turn, and this is the part I promised you at the very beginning, because everything I have told you so far is warm and sweet, and now it goes cold. Out at the University of Wisconsin, there were 2 scientists, a husband and wife, Elizabeth and James Miller, and they spent their careers studying a hard question. They wanted to know how the body sometimes takes a perfectly natural thing and turns it inside you into something that can cause cancer. And they fed that flavoring oil out of sassafras, the saffrole, to rats and mice. They fed it in their food day after day for months, some of them near 2 years, and those animals grew tumors in their livers. What was happening, they found, is that the body takes that oil and changes it into a form that can grab hold of your DNA, the very instructions inside your cells. And it happened again and again across the doses. It was consistent, and that is the word that matters most to a scientist. So on the 3rd of December, 1960, the FDA came down with its ruling. Any food containing saffrole or sassafras oil was against the law to sell in the United States. And then, later, in the 1970s, they went further and banned the bark itself, so you could not even buy it to brew your own at home. The door was shut and locked and the key thrown in the creek. And the root beer makers, they turned on a dime. Every last one of them reformulated fast because they had no choice. Some used an artificial sassafras flavor cooked up in a lab. Some used an extract of the real root with the saffrole taken out of it. And that is what you are drinking today, my friend. The root beer in your glass right now is a careful blend of vanilla and wintergreen and black cherry bark and licorice and sarsaparilla and anise and cinnamon and sweet birch, all tuned by clever people to taste exactly like sassafras, with not one bit of real sassafras in it. The big makers do not use the true root at all anymore. It is a ghost of a flavor, a memory dressed up to fool your tongue, and I will admit, it fools it pretty well. Now here comes the twist, the thing I told you would not sit right, and I want you to think hard about it with me. Those rats and mice got doses no human being could ever reach, not sipping tea, not chewing gum, not a lifetime of root beer. The animals were eating an amount, day after day, that a person drinking a cup of spring tea would take a small lifetime of Sundays to match. A single cup of sassafras tea holds only a tiny fraction of what those animals were fed. But here's the part that truly gets me. That oil, that saffrole, is not some rare poison that only hides in sassafras. It is sitting in your kitchen this very minute. It is naturally in nutmeg. It is in cinnamon. It is in black pepper. It is in sweet basil, the kind you put on your tomatoes. Every one of those is on every shelf in America, and not one of them was ever banned. Not one. You will sprinkle saffrole on your supper tonight, and nobody will say a word. Only sassafras lost its seat at the table. Only the root beer root. How can that be? Well, the FDA was acting under a rule from 1958 called the Delaney Clause, and that rule was hard as iron. It said if a thing causes cancer in animals at any dose at all, then it is out at any level, no matter how small. There was no room in that rule for common sense about real-world amounts. It did not ask how much a person would actually swallow. It just asked, did it ever cause cancer in any animal? And if the answer was yes, the gate came down. Sassafras got caught square in that gate. And there is a stranger twist yet, and I will handle it gently because it is a dark corner. Many years later, folks discovered that this same oil could be used as an ingredient to cook up an illegal street drug, the one they call ecstasy. So saffrole landed on the watch list of the drug agents right alongside the hard chemicals. It went from your grandmother's teacup to a controlled substance. In 2015, the police up in Canada seized about 1,500 kilograms of sassafras oil in a single bust. Think on that. The same sweet oil that flavored a child's candy hauled off in a police raid. That is how far this root fell. But I promised you the thread never fully broke. And it did not. Remember the filé, the green powder from the leaves? Well, the leaves hold almost none of that oil. Almost none. So filé powder slipped right under the ban, and it is still perfectly legal, still sold in Louisiana to this very day. Choctaw families and Creole families still make it by hand every single fall, gathering the red leaves, drying them in the shade, pounding them soft, just exactly like always. And the trees themselves, they never went anywhere. They still grow wild all across the eastern country, throwing up their mitten leaves, and if you scrape a root today, it still smells just as sweet as it did in 1876. And I will tell you quietly, there are still old folks back in these hollows who brew a cup of spring tea and have never once asked anybody's permission. So let me leave you with the question that walks with me on my rounds. Here is a plant that fed a people and flavored a whole continent and doctored the sick for 300 years. And we judged it in the end by rats eating a dose no living person would ever eat, under a rule that could not tell the difference between a poison barrel and a teacup. And meanwhile, the very same thing inside it sits untouched in the nutmeg and the cinnamon on your shelf, and nobody blinks. One plant, and one plant only, lost its place at the American table. and I cannot help but feel we lost a little something of ourselves when we let it go. A little thread back to the people who knew this ground before us. Now before you go, do me a kindness and tell me just 2 things down in the comments. Tell me whether you ever tasted real sassafras tea, the true kind, when you were young, and tell me what the old folks in your family used it for. I read as many as I can, every one, and it does my heart good. Look after yourselves, and stay close to the ground, and come walk the woods with me again real soon. And next time I am going to tell you about 17 plants you are not actually allowed to grow. Some of them are sitting for sale at your garden center right now, pretty as you please. Some of them grow wild in the ditch at the end of your road. And a few of them, if you plant them, could put you standing in front of a federal judge. You will not believe which ones. Come find out.